Good evening. My name is Domingo Morel. I am an associate professor of political science and public service here at Wagner. I'll be moderating the conversation tonight. Before we get started, I just want to acknowledge Professor Arlene Davila, who is the director of the Latinx Project, who's here with us today. Arlene and her team have provided the resources for this conversation that we're having today. And I just want to thank her because when I approached the Latinx Project about hopefully getting some funding to organize an event like this, a conversation around the presidential election and Latino voters, they were enthusiastic about it and said, "Palante, go ahead," and supported us. So round of applause to the Latinx Project. Thank you. So just a couple of things. When I thought about organizing this event, it was the summer, and I was thinking, you know what? Let's have a conversation towards the end of the semester, because by then there was going to be this exciting Republican primary where we debate and have this fight over who's going to be the nominee for the Republican Party, and try to think about how is it that Latinos fit within that conversation, and then going forward for the presidential conversation process. Of course, it didn't turn out that way, right? It was grand opening, grand closing. It started quick and ended quickly, right? We didn't have that, but nevertheless, it's still we think a very, very important conversation to have about Latinos in this electorate, the presidential election, and beyond. Before I introduce the panelists for this evening, I would like to ask the Dean of the Wagner School, Graduate School of Public Service, Dr. Sherry Glee, to come up and say a couple of words on behalf of Wagner. Dr.
Great. Okay. Well, I am so delighted that we're doing this event. I thank you, Domingo, for bringing it to us, and thank you very much to the Latinx Project at NYU for sponsoring it. I'm really excited that we're in this. Well, I'm not excited that we're in this space. We're about to move out of it. But I'm excited that we as a school are talking about these issues. They're really important, and it's great to be collaborating with the rest of NYU to do it. One of our goals at Wagner is to introduce our students and our community to multiple perspectives on important issues, and this is a clear example of doing exactly that. You're going to hear from several Latinx politics experts and learn a little bit about the role of Latinx communities and Latinx voters in this election. I unfortunately am going to have to leave after a few minutes, but I'm going to call Domingo back to start the conversation going.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So to our panelists, the way that we're going to organize this conversation today is for like the first hour or so, we'll have a conversation. I'll be moderating the conversation, and I'll be asking the questions from the panelists. And that will be hopefully up till about 7 o'clock. We have a timekeeper, wonderful timekeeper, Shannon, in the back. So our panelists, please pay attention to our timekeeper. Look at that, she has the 5 minutes, 4 minutes, and 3 minutes, and stuff like that. So please pay attention to the timekeeper. We want to stay as close as possible to the 7 o'clock hour, because from 7 to 7:30, we'll have Q&A. Really want you to be part of the discussion as well. Following that, we'll have a reception outside of the room. Hopefully you could attend that as well. So I'm going to introduce the panelists now. First panelist, Cristina Beltrán. Cristina, raise your hands for those of you who don't know you. Dr. Beltrán is an associate professor in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis at NYU. A political theorist by training, her research focuses on modern and contemporary political theory, Latino and US ethnic racial politics, and feminist and queer theory. She is the author of The Trouble with Unity, Latino Politics and the Creation of Identity, and Cruelty as Citizenship, How Migrant Suffering Sustains White Democracy. Along with Libby Anker, she is also co-editor of the journal Theory and Event. Welcome, Dr. Beltrán. To her right is Professor Yalidy Matos. Yalidy Matos is an associate professor of political science at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. She earned her PhD from The Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio, and her BA degree from Connecticut College in New London, Connecticut. Originally from the Dominican Republic, Yalidy is a 1.5 generation immigrant and a first generation scholar. Matos' scholarly work examines the intersections of race, ethnicity, and gender, and public opinion and political behavior. By drawing on theoretical frameworks from various disciplines, she uses a mixed methods approach to understand the racialized nature of US immigration policies, as well as other politically consequential public and social policies. Professor Matos examines the political behavior of different racial and ethnic groups in relation to identity politics. Welcome, Dr. Matos. And finally, not least, we have from Paris, Professor Yamil Velez, who was planning to be with us in person, but has an exchange opportunity, and he's been at Paris since. So welcome from wonderful Paris. He is an assistant professor of political science at Columbia University. He completed his PhD in political science at Stony Brook University and holds BAs in political science and psychology from Florida State University. His research and teaching interests lie at the intersection between racial and ethnic politics, political psychology, and political geography, with a focus on immigration. Prior to coming to Columbia, he was an assistant professor at George Washington University and Wesleyan University. So please, round of applause for all of our panelists. Here. Yamil, we're going to start off with you. Okay, I'm sorry, that's loud. So this question, the same question for all of the panelists. They each have 5 minutes to answer. What is something that we should know about Latinx voters that is not very well known or perhaps misunderstood? Floor is yours.
Yeah, that's a great question, Domingo. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm glad to share the stage with some folks I really look up to in terms of their work. I'd say that something that is a bit misunderstood, and it is something that comes from a lot of the media discourse on Latinos, specifically in 2020, is the question of misinformation, right? I think there has been a lot of focus, rightfully so, on the idea of Spanish language misinformation floating through WhatsApp, affecting the community, and something that is, I think, important and we should always keep in mind is that obviously our community is very diverse in terms of language use. Although Spanish language misinformation is certainly an issue, we also have to open our eyes to misinformation that's floating more broadly through networks and even among bilingual or English, mostly English-speaking Latinos. And so I think that's something that, in some ways has been misunderstood. And I think part of it is a conflation of like language use and being Latino, that by virtue of being Latino, we're going to be exposed to content in Spanish. And, if we look at a lot of the media consumption habits of specifically like younger Latinos, they're consuming media both in English and Spanish on social media through a lot of some of the outlets that the broader population is also consuming, right? Standard news sites, TikTok, Instagram, and so on. And so I think when we talk about this issue of misinformation, let's not narrow the scope to the subset, right, of folks who consume it in Spanish, but also think more broadly about how misinformation is affecting our political system. And so I would say that's something that has been misunderstood in some ways, has been there's been a singular focus on that when the issue I think is broader. I would say a related point, there is certainly misinformation circulating within the community, but there's an assumption that we have a lot of true believers in the community or something that are like buying this wholesale. And actually, if you look at a lot of the polling, the modal response is not that people are buying into misinformation, but rather that people are uncertain about what's true and what's false. And so what you see is like a lot of people kind of unsure about this gray area. They've seen something online, a family member shared something with them, and it's not that they're wholesale buying into whatever is, that they're being exposed to. Instead, they're kind of somewhere in the middle. They don't know if it's true or if it's false. And I think one of the central challenges for us in trying to understand media environments, misinformation, is to think about ways of trying to clarify politics, and try to reduce this uncertainty in either educating folks about what kinds of tactics people might use online to deceive them or manipulate them, or also providing more like clear kind of information about the political system, such that people aren't being presented with a very extreme view of political parties or candidates. And so I would say that those probably are, and they're more in my wheelhouse, obviously, because this is part of my focus. But I would say those two things of like, let's not narrow the issue of misinformation to the Spanish language domain, although certainly it's an important place to look. And also, let's not also make the assumption that the Latino community is like gullible and just buying into whatever's floating around online. Like there is discernment, but more than discernment, there's a lot of skepticism. And so it's something that I think we should keep in mind when we're talking about these topics. And the media loves talking about it, especially after 2020. I think we need more clarity on those points.
Oh, thank you very much. Yalidy?
Sure. Thank you, Yamil, for starting that conversation. And thank you, Domingo, and the Latinx Project for having us here and starting this conversation. So I wrote a lot of things down on this. I was trying to think, what the tread of like what I was thinking, but there were so many things. And I'll leave some of the comments that I have on mis and disinformation for a little bit later. But I think one thing that I don't know so much that it gets misunderstood within Latinx communities, but I do think that it gets misunderstood by folks outside of the community, but also like the major parties. And that is that Latinx individuals are not a monolith. And so I think that when parties are trying to vie for this thing that we're calling the Latino voting bloc, I'm sort of unsure who those folks are, right? And they're kind of different, multiple blocks every which way, right? So if we look at South Florida, right, who's the voting bloc there? If we look at Texas, Arizona, Nevada, they're not all the same. But I think that the major parties and the campaigns almost treat Latinos as the same. And I think something that gets misunderstood is that those left behind feel left behind, right? And so, I don't see any campaign towards particular groups other than kind of like the big ones in the swing states. So I was actually happy to see, I don't know if happy is the word, but I was intrigued to see that there was this new ad. They've been running ads. I don't know who it is, but it's been delivered in like a Puerto Rican accent in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And I think that something like that we've not really seen where these parties are kind of like targeting particular groups. That was probably the only one that I saw that was different and new. But of course, the other ones that we see the ads being targeted to, right, Cubans in South Florida. But when we talk about South Florida, there's been such mass migration of other Latinx folks in South Florida. And so you're targeting ads towards Cubans, but you're leaving Venezuelans, Dominicans, Haitians, you're leaving those groups out, right? Who then feel like, well, why should I even show up? Right? If folks think that this is a community that matters, why show up? Right? And so we have this, group of non-voters, we have people who are unmotivated, but we also have the ads themselves demobilizing, right, by not paying attention to particular groups. So I think something that even academics, right, fall into the trap of calling all Latinos, having all Latinos in the same models, right, and we really don't know who's driving what. So I think that for me is one of the things that we, I think we should know more about. And I think that I'm in great presence, right, to chat with Cristina, right, who wrote this book, right, The Trouble with Unity. And I think that we're still having trouble. Right, it is very troubling to me. And I think that there are groups that are highly political. And you and I know this because we work on Dominican political incorporation, super political, but hardly ever targeted. And they're kind of this throwaway group, right? Oh, they're just going to vote Democratic, right? Until they don't. And then you're kind of backing up and be like, oh, wait a minute, let's go back, right? So that's one thing that keeps me up at night. And then I think the other thing I will note on this question is young Latinx voters. And I think that they are a group of people in relation to this idea of mis and disinformation that are super unmotivated and demobilized by this particular 2024 election. And I don't know that the major parties have figured out how to mobilize them. And I think part of the problem is I think young Latinx individuals are kind of like, oh, these are the same two people, and so they're very much like, oh, not again. I just taught my last class, U.S. Latinx politics, and I was trying to like ask them questions, get them motivated, and they were just like, we don't like anybody. Right. And one young lady said, I wish that there was a new candidate somewhere, right? Somebody that we can learn about, like not a person that we kind of already know, one person we already knew, 4 years ago, another person we've just seen 4 years, right? And so they're really demobilized. And I will say that so Latino voters make up an estimated 15% of eligible voters this year. And I believe young Latinx voter make up 40% of that, right? That is a huge percentage of individuals who are demobilized and unmotivated. So I think we need to have more conversations with young Latinx people, but I also think that elites need to really have a conversation about that, right? And Latinos are only going to continue to grow, right? Like young Latinx people are only going to continue. Latinos are the second highest like group that's like increasing in voters, right? So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Cristina.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And okay, I'm using this mic. And I have a lot of my students here, which is great because we were literally just talking about this. So I think we have good. So they might hear a little bit of repetition with some of this. So thank Yamil and Yalidy and LatinX Project and Domingo for making this happen because we knew we need to have a lot of these conversations before the election, precisely to Yalidy's point about mobilization and demobilization of populations. I think it's really, really key. I think one of the biggest misconceptions, and this is something we talk a lot about in my classes, is the understanding that this is not a single electorate, it's multiple electorates, and that we talk about it like a singular one is part of the problem, right? This is a multiple set of communities. And so thinking about Latino diversity by age, by education, by sexual orientation, by region, by race, really talking about that as opposed to talking about Latinos in one way, I think is a really something that other folks have raised, but I think continues to be a problem with popular conceptions. And I think one of the other things that's really interesting is this is a population that is growing in its vote. Like we are voting at higher and higher levels at each election. So on the one hand, it's a growing electorate, but the other side of it is a lot of people still haven't been voting. So the simultaneity of those two things, that there's both a growing electorate and a lot of people still need to be mobilized and have been demobilized. I think because those two things are true with this, this very large population, means that you get these articles that are like Latinos aren't voting, or Latinos are their numbers are growth. And so it can be very confusing for the public, I think, because depending on how they read the data, they talk about the population in radically different terms. And I think that's really confusing to a lot of people trying to make sense of the fact. But it's partly because we're talking about them like they're one thing rather than multiple things. Yeah, I have some data too. I'll do the same thing. I think it's just useful just background, right? It's a multiplicity of populations that really vary by region and state. And I think even thinking about the different sort of community ecosystems Latinos exist in really matters, like what it means to be in Texas versus in California versus in Arizona. But the other point I would make that we talked a lot about today in my class was what a young population this is. And so really thinking about the youth population for two things, right? That under 30 Latinos make up over 30%, a third of Latino voters. And so, which also means that Latinos are more likely to be first-time voters. And that Latinos are, half of Latinos under 30 were first-time voters in 2020 and 2022. So the fact that so many people, so I think also when we talk about this as an electorate, on the one hand, we have the fact that there have been people who've been voting for a long time and we are looking at their behavior and if they're shifting, but we're also looking at people who've never voted before. Like the electorate itself is dynamic and is changing. And so we have to think about that in terms of what the electorate looks like, because these are new people participating at each election. And the other thing is what a set of, I think the misinformation or just the under discussed issue is what a missed opportunity this is, in the sense that there are so many people who are eligible who haven't yet voted. And so one example I like to give is there are 12 million Latinos eligible, roughly approximately, right, eligible to vote who've not yet registered to vote, right? And about 16.6 million voted in the 2020 election. So 16.6 voted, there are 12 million that haven't voted, that are eligible but haven't voted yet. So the number of people that can still be mobilized to become part of this electorate. And I think one of the issues is we don't talk enough about democracy in that sense, right? That it actually takes a lot of work to turn non-voters into voters or new voters into voters. And the effort and energy it takes to do that work is something we need to really focus our energy on, and parties need to focus their energy on that. And it's an ongoing process to turn non-voters into voters. And if they're not reached out to, and because nearly half of this population are in Texas and California for the presidency, it means that those are two places where nobody's spending a lot of resources mobilizing them, right? Versus Latinos in Nevada or Latinos in Pennsylvania, you know, they're going to get mobilized in a different way because of their locate, Florida, right? Because of that. So I think there's such a gap in terms of state by state, the kind of mobilization that's happening in different states, and that there needs to be equity in that, or more energy placed in places where Latinos are a huge number. And then I guess the last thing I think is a kind of misunderstanding is that Latinos are still reliably democratic, but the fact that Latinos are, that there's no longer, as one person put it, Democrats can no longer rely on simply mobilizing this constituency. They have to persuade this constituency. So I think the fact that some Latinos have shifted right and have been voting Republican, some of the media got very like man bites dog about it and are like, Latinos are becoming Republicans, and all the articles acted as if Latinos as a group are just shifting right. And that is not what's happening. But something is happening. So we can't pretend it's not happening. Like there is a shift to the right. There are more Latinos who are being pulled into right-leaning constituencies, right-leaning assemblages, conservative political movements. And so we need to understand that, but also not talk as if Latinos as a group are suddenly switching their identification, because that's not what's happening. And I think sometimes, because it's such a multiple and diverse population, there's a lot of misinformation about the population, in part because people want to talk about the population like it's one population, like it's one thing. And so they say it like it's everybody instead of that it's part and parcel. So the need for specificity is an ongoing battle that a lot of us have been talking about for a very long time.
Well, thank you, Cristina. So, Yamil, you got us started on the question on the topic of information. And so, Yalidy, we'll start this question off with you. So information is an essential aspect of politics, as all of you have mentioned already. And so can you talk about the importance or influence of media ecosystems, social media, Spanish language television, cable news, etc., in informing or misinforming Latino voters?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this question is so important, and just the topic of information, misinformation, disinformation. Some of the things that I was researching, actually, my students and I also talked about this. I was happy to see that there has been some strides in the major networks like Telemundo and Univision, right, to try to tackle misinformation, disinformation. One of the ways in which young Latinx voters come back into the mix with this question is that they are heavily targeted because they use social media, digital media much more. And it's just easy to sort of, reshare, reshare something you didn't really read, right? You just kind of saw a little headline, oh, this looks kind of fun. Let me just reshare it. So I'm political, right? But like you didn't really read it or you didn't realize who was putting it out there. So I came across two sort of things happening with the Hispanic Federation and Televisa Univision, right? They announced that they're becoming partners on a nonpartisan campaign to mobilize Latino voters through registration drives, informational workshops, phone banks, and battling misinformation. Telemundo also recently announced Decisión 2024, which is also about like trying to battle misinformation, disinformation. And Spanish language media plays a big role here because, I mean, a lot of Latinx folks watch and hear the news in Spanish. Not the majority of them actually don't, right? But those, 24 or so % that do, right? They're heavily targeted because it's actually harder to fact check. Right, when it's Spanish language, but you don't have the right folks fact checking. They don't know really what to look for, and they sort of make assumptions about it. There's a lot of like growing concerns about AI, right? And this is a new term for me. They're like deep fakes, which I was like, what is that? So deep fakes are this synthetic media that have been digitally manipulated to replace one person's likeness with another. And I was like, oh my goodness, that's happening. So just recently, this happened in New Hampshire. There were some robocalls that was faking Biden's voice and demobilizing, discouraging voting, right? And in fact, the ad said like, don't worry about the primaries, just to make sure you show up for the elections in November. So they were demobilizing primary voters and using Biden's fake voice, which is crazy. I mean, crazy to think that we live in this world where that is happening, where we call this a democracy, right? So, many get their news again from social media platforms like YouTube and WhatsApp. And this is where experts say misleading information in Spanish is less likely to be intercepted by moderators. And one key difference between disinformation, which is deliberate misinformation, right? So deliberate false facts, whereas misinformation may be intentional, right? So when there's disinformation, this is something that they're doing deliberately. There's been a lot of new campaigns by the Bold Pack, for example. They launched Our Lucha War Room, another campaign to respond to, in particular, conservative Republicans. So there's a lot happening on this, and there's a lot happening because it's like really important, right? The idea that individuals can be discouraging, demobilizing voters through the way that they get their news, right? And these are individuals that maybe are searching news, right? They're searching to learn something, and they're hit with something that isn't even real. And so all of that to say is that we should be mindful, right, of where we get our information. We should be mindful of what we share and reshare. And I think that this particular question also calls us to be accountable to one another, right? So it's one thing to kind of always leave it in the external. People are doing this to us. There's misinformation, disinformation towards other communities as well, of course. But it does call us to be accountable, right? Calls us to make sure we know where we're getting our news, right? To double check, right? Don't just go to the first thing and then say, oh, that's true. But it also calls us to be more mindful and to call each other out, right? So if I were to share something and you'd say, I don't think that sounds right, like, let me know, right? If your family members or somehow there's a rumor that has started in your family household, right? Maybe you want to Google that and check the few sites, right? Before, or call them out. I don't think that's true. Actually, this person didn't say that, or that person didn't say that, right? So it does call us to be a little bit more active as community members.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because I do think that one of the things, and I think it's so important, Yalidy's point about like it's not just there's misinformation and disinformation, and that those aren't exactly the same thing. And so for us to be really clear that there's like the ongoing effort to misinform people purposefully, and then the ways that also people just get things wrong. And I think that's also, in class we were talking about the way that we can become spreaders ourselves of this. So that's the fact that people who don't intend to do that can actually participate in it. And so the spread of that information is kind of infects, a conversation non-intentionally. And so I think thinking about that is really important and being able to intervene. And I think it's really important for those of us who are engaged or concerned or really committed to elections, wanting this election to not be a Trump election, because I'm terrified, and making sure this doesn't happen, is that we do intervene in our families, because they may not believe like a New York Times fact-checking response, but they will believe like their nephew or their cousin or their sister or their, somebody in their son or daughter or somebody saying, hey, this isn't right. So you play this, we all play a key role with certain communities of people who believe us, right? Because we're part of their family and community conversations. But I think the other thing that I think is interesting is that we often think about misinformation. I think after the 2020 election, there was a bit of an intensified focus on misinformation, because a lot of people didn't want to admit that people voted for Trump because they meant to. So when Latinos were, it was misinformation. They voted for him because like they were lied to. And I think we need to be clear about people who did vote with kind of crazy thoughts in their heads because they were told something or they believe something. But I think the reality too that we have to sit with is that some people were voting for Trump because they agree with him, or he moved them, or they were just as informed as people who were voting for Biden. And so we just have to kind of sit with, I think there was kind of a dream that the reasons they were voting that way was because of like an error, as opposed to actually sitting with the fact that maybe they voted because they agreed with him on some things. And we have to sort of think about that. And the last thing I would say is I just think this is so important because of how young this population is. And the fact that this population is so young means they use social media more. And they're not necessarily going to the Washington Post or the New York Times. And to the point that people were saying, I think it was Yamil was just pointing out that means that a lot of people are just unsure of what's true. And that's partly what misinformation does, is it makes people just wonder if anything is really true. And just one of the facts, a quick thing from the Brookings Institute that Gabe Sanchez wrote was he had this data that 42% of 18 to 29-year-old Latinos were worried that there was widespread voter fraud and that you couldn't trust the election results, compared to 34% of Latinos 60 and over. So I think that has everything to do with like the older Latinos are probably just watching maybe more traditional news sites, and it's a younger generation that are just hearing so many different things that they just start to wonder what's true. And I think that.
Thank you, Cristina. Yamil, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I guess it's a personal story. Like one of the reasons why I've been drawn to studying information environments is because of a conversation I had with my abuela during 2020. She started telling me she was watching these experts on YouTube and started listing off all of these claims that I was just like, abuela, that's not true. And she's like, no, pero él es un doctor. So, I wanted to find a way to combat, some of what she was seeing online. And I went to the websites for Telemundo and Univision, and I would search for like, something had gone viral. It's like hundreds of thousands of people had seen these videos and there was nothing. And it turned out that they had disbanded their fact-checking units after 2016. And it wasn't like until October that they started reinvesting in those fact-checking units in 2020. So they kind of came to the game a little too late. And so for me, it's been something I've wanted to sort through is what are ways that we can actually make this information more accessible? Why aren't some of these organizations investing in it? And I've done some work finding that fact checks in Spanish, for instance, are still very effective within the community, even if it's like a newer format relative to fact checking in more traditional like English language outlets. I've also partnered with community organizations that provide news to Spanish-speaking Latinos in Arizona, North Carolina, and California. And so what they do is basically create these WhatsApp groups that are run by journalists. And they have chats every day. So Maritza Felix, who's in Arizona, she runs this organization called Conecta Arizona. She has something called La Hora de Cafecito that literally every single day, which is wild. Like she's an amazing person. Like every single day she's having conversations with people in her community. And they'll bring things to her. They'll be like, I heard this on the news. I saw this on social media. She fact checks live in this WhatsApp group. Like she'll send them links. Like it is incredible. And one of the challenges I think that Telemundo and Univision, some of these major outlets face, is that of course, they have a community interest because in some cases, like these local affiliates are run by Latinos, but there is a commercial interest. Like they have to do things that bring money to the organization, and sometimes that conflicts with mobilization and information and engagement, right? Sometimes that means prioritizing things like entertainment, and maybe not investing in let's say like a fact-checking arm, and so that I see a lot of places across the country where this gap is being filled by these community organizations, but that's really tough given our current local news environment, where local news, even just generally, is dying throughout the country. And so I think we need like robust support for news that it speaks to our community, but that also ensures that it's that we are funding people like Maritza that can have these one-on-one conversations with audience members. I mean, there are only so many Maritzas out there. There are only so many. So I've worked with folks like Madeline Bear and Paola, another journalist at Enlace Latino in North Carolina, and I think we have to find ways of equipping these like kind of citizen journalists too to fill some of these gaps in places where there isn't a lot of there aren't a lot of media options, yeah, if we want to address the misinformation issue, we might have to move beyond just the paradigm of like relying on the large commercial media conglomerates.
Thank you, Yamil. So Cristina, this question is for you first. So all of you have touched upon this to some degree already, but there is a lot that has been said about Latinx voters and partisan identification and whether we are at a moment of political realignment. What does the research tell us about Latinos and partisan identification? Are there particular trends that you think we should be paying attention to? Or aspects of the Latinx electorate and partisanship that we don't understand very well? So Cristina, so for this question, we have 4 minutes each, okay?
That's such a good question. There's so many parts to it that I'm like, oh, some of it we don't know yet, right? I mean, I think some of this is kind of happening live. And so I think the 2024 election is going to be really interesting to see what it means. Because, the last 2 elections, 2016 was a shock to people on the left and the right. 2020 was under COVID and under these really shocking, unprecedented conditions. So 2024 is going to be really interesting because this is sort of in both ways that are troubling, because it's like, the same again with this, like the kind of depressing repeat of this that I worry will demobilize people because they just feel like stuck in this horrible time loop. But also we'll finally just have kind of normal conditions in some ways to see what we're dealing with, if anything can be normal in this particular political moment. But I think 2 things I always think about with partisan identification is it has to do with the diversity of this population as well. And that is, I think that often the story has been about Latinos in terms of their voting. This is the way I often describe it, is that people are always asking, like, are Latinos going to vote like an ethnic group? Are Latinos like Italians or the Irish? And they're voting kind of like they're an ethnic group, and then they're going to kind of become like they'll become white, and they're going to become like they're going to kind of do that trail. They're going to go that track. Or are Latinos more like African Americans? They're going to be like they're a racialized population that will vote in kind of more cohesive ways or understand themselves as kind of a population of linked fate, right? And my answer is always yes. Like it's all happening. It's not that or that. I think those things are happening simultaneously. It depends on who you're looking at. And so I think we have to stop thinking that there's one answer to that question. Like some Latinos are experiencing themselves as a racialized population and feel themselves under assault by Donald Trump and by anti-immigrant politics, and they mobilize and organize as such. And then there are other Latinos who experience political life in really different ways. Maybe they're 4th generation. Maybe they're not they might not be as connected to these questions. They might experience migrants the same way lots of Anglos experience migrants, as something kind of somewhat distant to them. They may not go back to their countries of origin unless they're like on a booze cruise to Mexico, right? They don't feel this necessary deep link they're not transnational in that way. They may, have limited language skills. Although that doesn't guarantee conservative, politics, but they may have limited language skills. So they don't have that necessarily, that kind of connection. And so those Latinos are going to be susceptible to different kinds. All of these groups of people are susceptible to different sorts of being pulled across into different political partisan alignments. And so I think we just need to find ways of getting to data where we can get much more specific to figure out what are fourth generation Latinos, middle class Latinos who are non-college educated but middle class, like how are they voting? Versus how, college educated second generation, like I think we just need to get much more specific so we can start tracing what the partisan alignments are and get a better sense of it. But then there's also the case that people vote in ways that we still find just sort of mysterious. But I think the one thing I'll point to, and I was talking to my class about this today, that I just think is important is we haven't accounted enough for the rise of the Homeland Security state over the last 20 years. That Latino populations are both they're the victims of it and they're the employees of it. And that has grown, the militarization of the border, the growth in policing that we just saw at NYU. We see it all the time in New York City as examples of the hyper militarized police that we see everywhere. All of that, if you look at those police, those are Black and brown people. If you look at the Border Patrol, that's a lot of Latinos. So on the one hand, you have massive protests against carceral politics, but you also have a lot of people who are being socialized into it. We've also had a 20-year war, endless war since 9/11 with Afghanistan and Iraq that only recently winded up. So we have all these veterans. So these are all things that I think are having an effect on partisanship that we're just beginning to really understand. That so many people's livelihoods, incomes, and cultural spaces they exist in have been shaped by carceral arrangements like that, that they are employed by those. And that affects people's politics over time. And I don't think we've really thought about it enough. And so that for me is a really interesting place of partisanship.
Thank you. Yamil.
Yeah, so I definitely want to echo what Cristina has said, and David Cortez at Notre Dame has done some really great work on basically these folks who are border patrol agents and how they view their identities and how they think about immigration, which in some ways kind of aligns with the job description, right, of taking a more restrictionist stance. That in some ways, like this idea of trying to unpack what has happened within the community and trying to figure out a way to describe the trends without, again, flattening the entire group has been what has motivated, I think, some of the work I've been doing more recently with Bernard Fraga and Emily West. And what we found really is the shift was not a broad-based shift in the sense that obviously all Latinos, as Cristina has pointed out, experienced a conservatizing force. Instead, it was certain segments within the community that we saw kind of shift to the right. And so people who had more conservative crime policy attitudes, those were the Latinos who grew in their support of Trump over time. Those who had a more kind of restrictionist stance on immigration, they also grew in support of Trump over time. Whereas if we looked at age and other kind of categories that we often think might be important in politics, we didn't see much movement over time there. And so, what we wanted to draw attention to was to say that there's a lot of heterogeneity within the community. And so for us to really understand what's going on with these shifts, like we want to unpack the subgroups that are moving the most, as opposed to, again, making these broad assumptions about a broad-based Latino shift or racial realignment. We need to enter these discussions, I think, with a lot more nuance. I worry that a lot of the flawed language that we had about demography is destiny from, let's say 10 or 20 years ago is being repeated again, but now it's like demography is destiny, but it's now pushing this group toward the GOP. Like we need to be able to say yes for some and no for others.
Thank you. Yalidy.
Yeah, for sure. So I have a few facts actually based on this conversation, right? So from last time, right, Trump found support among Latinos who work in law enforcement along the Mexican border. Cuban Americans in Florida, averse to policies they view as approaching socialism, evangelical Christians attracted to Christian nationalism, and second and third US-born Latinos who were more likely to identify and vote alongside their white non-Hispanic peers, right? Education is also a big moderator, right? So there's a difference between non-college and college-educated Latinos, right? And so in this, and I guess the theme of today's conversation, right, is that Latinos are a varied group. And I think it's really important to try to understand almost like underneath some of these, anti-crime, anti-immigration sort of policy preferences, but also ideology. I think that one of the things that we shy away from in talking within our community is, for example, anti-Black ideology and anti-Blackness, right? A lot of that is driving crime policy preferences, immigration policy preferences, what we think about our peers, where we live, right? And so, many of us come from, if you're a foreign born, we might be coming from a country where that was rampant, right? Some of my work is looking at Afro-Latina consciousness, right? And the ways in which Afro-Latinas are behaving differently than other Latinos, right? And Afro-Latinos in particular who identify as Black, right, are leaving the Latino group altogether. They feel no linked fate with other Latinos, right? That's got to tell you what's going on within the community, right? And I think that we probably need to fix that first, or think about that first, and talk about that first, right? And another actually survey, I just fielded in January, February, two really interesting came out of that. There was lower than 50% of the Latino respondents who said that democratic ideology, democratic partisanship was an attribute of being Latino, right? Lower than 50, right? So it was like in the 40s, right? So it was not a majority. Less than a majority also said that liberal ideology was an attribute of being Latino, right? So these are not things that are given, right? We might think like, oh, you look like me, and so, we kind of go together. But there's certainly so much variation, I think, within ideology that we don't talk about because we focus a lot on partisanship, right? And I think for many Latinx groups coming from different kinds of countries, with different countries that have different kinds of ideologies, right, that they may feel that the ideology is not being represented in the United States. So when it comes to like this question of party realignment in particular, I actually saw the same Brookings report by Gabe over at UNM. So only 44% of Latinos under the age of 40 believe that the Democratic Party is hostile. Okay, that's good, right? Only 4% believe that the Democratic Party is hostile. But 37% reported that Biden and Democrats do not care about the Latino community. Right, that's a huge gap, right? Yeah, this party is not hostile, but I don't think these individuals who are in leadership now actually care, right? And 37% said that they believe Republicans care, right? So there's certainly something happening, right? And I think it's moving in various directions. One of the things, to bring it back to maybe the first question you asked about, something that gets misunderstood, is that, for many Latinx individuals, sometimes, right, there are those in the center that we don't talk about, right? Maybe the independents, but also the ones that are non-party affiliated, right? Not the strong partisans. We often kind of talk about the strong Democrats and then the strong Republicans. There's so many Latinx folks in the middle that are the most persuaded, right? They're the ones that are most malleable, right? They're the ones sort of seeking information to try to figure it out, right? Because they're not tied to one or the other. And again, that might be a foreign, if you're foreign born, right, that might be tied to, maybe you didn't know about the parties in your home country, or you did and didn't like them. So that's one thing that I think that we don't understand as much, right? Is Latino independence and Latinos in the middle, how they make decisions, what they're thinking, what they care about. Are they the same policies that other strong partisans care about? And I think the better set of questions are really about Latino non-voters, right? Latino independents, moderates, swing voters. So according to a 2022 Pew report, nearly 9 in 10 Latino Democrats say the Democratic Party represents their interests. This was 80% of Latino Republicans, right? That said the Democratic Party does not represent their interests, right? So these are individuals that they're upset in their ways, right? So we shouldn't be looking to see, I don't know that the shift is all the way here to all the way here. I think the shift is like from here to the middle, from here to the middle, and then they sort of decide election by election. And that I think gets lost in this conversation about party realignment, or this conversation between linked fate and they're becoming, they're all become, going to vote as non-Hispanic whites, right? Because there's no nuance there. It's just one or the other. But we're missing a good group of people who we just don't know anything about.
Yeah, thank you. So I have one more question, and I'm going to try to cheat and create two questions out of one, because I do want to get to the audience questions. So the three of you could pick whichever question you want to answer. First, as a political scientist who are obviously engaged in this work, what are you looking forward to seeing in this 2024 election? Like, as a scholar, obviously as a member of the Latinx community, or communities, as you've all made it very clear, like what are you looking for, right? The second part is, and you could pick whichever one you want to answer. We have all these wonderful young people in the audience. We're at a school of public service. And so not all of them are Wagner students, but all of them, they're all young, right? And they're here because they want to learn, and they're engaged in some, at least in this way. What would you say to our young people about this particular moment, the importance of them participating in this moment? And again, they're here, they're learning, they're engaging. So it's not like, to some degree, we're talking about speaking to the choir here. But so you choose where you want to go. A message to the young people, or what are you thinking about? What questions you have coming up, right? It's up to you.
Okay. I think I'm going to go with the more optimistic one. Like you said, this might be preaching to the choir, but I think one of the things I mentioned earlier, right, is to participate not just electorally, right, but participate in ways with your friend groups, sharing, accurate information, talking to your family members. So one of the things topics I work on are, women of color candidates and women of color voters. And many of the things that come out of that work is that oftentimes individuals are mobilized by talking to family and friends, right? Rather than something inherently civic. Some of us have that, some of us maybe not so much, depending on what's going on in the world. Driving people to the polls. I mean, there's so much that, volunteering with organizations that are doing registration. For example, if you are somebody who lives in a particular community, or you're part of a community and you want to go to a neighborhood where there are more people like you, right? It's great when you're trying to register somebody who I'm Dominican, right? It's great if I'm in Washington Heights volunteering and really, talking to Dominicans in their language. Be like, yeah, I get it, but let me tell you, just gonna sign right here and we're gonna get you registered. I did some canvassing work when I was younger. And it was great. It's a little, we're not in those times, so don't go into people's homes. But I used to go in and sit down for cafecito, and we talk about the political process and the candidate.
To do that,
yeah, I meant don't go inside the house.
We need them.
Not anymore. So yeah, I mean, being active in that way, right? That it's not just electorally, although I do want you, if you are eligible to vote, to go vote. Even though it isn't the most ideal, I think my message to you would be this too shall pass. Neither of the candidates can run again. That's a great thing, right? So, it will pass, and it might be ugly, and we might not like it, and it might be uncomfortable, and there might be things and policies that are just disgusting, right? For our communities, but it will pass. And the more that we participate, the more that we're still engaged, the better, right? We're going to come out on the other side. So don't get demobilized and try to mobilize others.
Thank you.
Sure, that's a great questions. I always think, so I'm always thinking about two things. I think one of the problems about voting, and we've talked about this a little bit in our class, of like just about, a lot of people feel like the political system is broken, and they are not wrong. Our political system is really, really, really broken in a bunch of ways in terms of who's represented, the electoral college, the fact that certain rural regions are deeply overrepresented compared to urban areas. I mean, like the fact that the Senate, there's two representatives for California, and then two representatives for like the Dakotas. Like, I mean, just those kinds of questions of like the underrepresentation of lots of people. There's a lot to be concerned about that is broken. And yet, I think the most important thing is for people to realize that elections, and I think we just need to get this across to your friends and family, is that I think we view elections as if you're giving them like your love, like you're giving, like it's like The Bachelor and you're giving them a rose, like that giving Biden your vote is like, I really like you. And so your vote is like this gift you give to and the candidate receives the gift of your vote. And I think and so then we view our vote as like this gift. And then it's like, well, I don't like any of these people, so I'm going to withhold my gift. And because I don't like either of you very much. And so I think we have a really kind of broken view of voting, as if voting is for them, that you're doing it and Biden gets something from it. And so you're going to punish Biden by showing him by not voting for Biden, as opposed to really viewing voting as like you're voting to save your own life. You're voting to save the life of your community. You're voting to wield political power so that you can shape the future you want. And so to view voting as an act of power taking and an act of radical claiming of your own ability to determine your own life and your own future, like we need a radical account of voting as something that's about you doing something for you and your community, and it's not about them. It's about you, right? And I think trying to convince people of that so that that way you're animated by voting, not because of the candidate, but because you're trying to figure out who can I pressure, right? Who can I make, and also how can I stop authoritarian rule coming to this country? So like the stakes could not be higher. So I think in that sense, there's sort of two things. One is that the stakes could not be higher. So you're doing something incredibly important and consequential. And to draw your friends and family into doing something this is a life-changing election, and you can help save this nation, which is a really amazing thing to be able to be a part of. And I think that in that sense, like my class, we've studied like massive resistance during the 1950s and 60s and anti-segregation politics. There have been anti-democratic moments where this country could have gone other ways. And so there are sort of periods where we're all asked to step up. And so I think this is one of those moments. And it's not about Biden. And in some ways it's about Trump, but it's about something bigger than him. And so I hope that we can like convince people to participate on those terms and not just like dealing with this, feeling of like, oh God, these guys again. Like, yes, these guys again, but there's something so much bigger at stake. And so I hope that we can convince people. And the other thing I would say is get involved in some way, whether it's online, going into the community, going to Pennsylvania, going to some swing state that matters, because we matter less here, unfortunately, but you can still do a lot here in local elections. But get involved, because I think one way I always talk about get out the vote is GOTV is my Xanax. Like I start to feel really scared and freaked out about what's going to happen. And I start thinking about climate. I start thinking about policing. I start thinking about the detention centers. I get really anxious. And one thing that helps me not be anxious is I do something. And so if it's like writing postcards to voters in Georgia, whatever it is, I always feel better when I've done something. And so that's my big thing. Do something so you'll feel better. You won't feel so scared.
Thank you, Cristina. Yamil, before we go to you, so speaking of something that people might not know, in the Dakotas, North Dakota, South Dakota, the two states with the fastest growing Latino population, right? Believe it or not, right? Yeah, still not very many people, yeah. Yamil.
Yeah, it's really hard to follow these two very optimistic messages, or at least like let's say action-oriented messages and messages of agency, which is super powerful. I guess what I'd add to it is to say that the Census Bureau projects that by 2060, 1 in 4 Americans will be Latino. which means there's a lot of power that's going to be on the table in terms of, representation, both descriptive and substantive. And I think it's something that we should keep in mind when we're thinking about political participation, that it's not just for now, but it's also for the future. And things like voting are habitual. And so beginning this process now can have these ripple effects that can impact us over time, but potentially can impact friends and family members that we might be able to persuade. I think one area that we need to draw more attention to is local politics. And a recent report that I put together with some co-authors at Columbia and Harvard and George Washington, we found that despite growing populations, Latinos have not seen corresponding increases in terms of representation in local and county governments. And so we need more candidates running for office. So Yalidy's work, I think, is fantastic in terms of highlighting those gaps and finding out ways of motivating a lot of folks in this room that could probably run for office to do it. The city councilor who represents my district is a Columbia grad. I believe he's like in his late 20s. Grew up in Washington Heights and was elected and has done a great job serving the community. And so, I think that's another element of political participation that doesn't get enough attention, which is voting is certainly important, but there's also another way of serving your community and being in elected office or serving on community boards is another path to representation. And yeah, you can start as young as in your mid-20s once you're done with your time at Wagner.
Well, thank you, and shout out to school boards. Participate on school boards. I'm on the school. I'm on the board of the Newark Public Library board, so we do important work. Shout out to the school board. Okay, time for Q&A. Shannon, how should we do? You have the microphone. You'll go. Okay, so you raise your hand, and Shannon will come to you, and
Thank you. Huh? Oh, yes. Hi, my name is Jasmine. Okay, it's on. Yes, my name is Jasmine. I go to CAS and Tisch, and I'm in class. Sorry, what? Oh, sorry. Okay. My question was actually based on the point that you just gave, Professor Beltrán, where you were talking about like not voting or voting for Biden because it's not like a gift. Because I think this is also something that I'm on the fence about as well, and I'd like to hear your thoughts about it. I think at least a lot of the dialogue that I hear on this subject amongst other young people is not so much that people are concerned about voting for Biden as a gesture of kindness towards him, but not voting for Biden because to do so would set a precedent for the Democratic Party as long as you keep on putting forward candidates that are at least better than the opposition, you can put forward anyone and not actually listen to your constituents. And I think I have to fact check this, but I've seen somewhere else that there are some Democrats who've gone as far as to deliberately fund really extremist Republicans just because they know that if they have an opponent who is that bad, then they can generate more support towards their platform, as opposed to letting Republicans put forward someone who's not fantastic, but also not bad, and then have a harder battle to fight. And so I think at the same time, one of the issues that I have with my generation at times is that I feel like we tend to take every election one by one. So it's in 4 years we'll do this, and in 4 years we'll do that. And there's never a long-term plan for are we thinking about the election in 2028 or 2032? Are we thinking that far? I don't know if we are, but yeah, at least my concern with voting for Biden is the precedent it would set.
I'd like other people maybe start. Give thoughts about that question. I think it's a great, I think it is, I think the candidate quality concern that people have is, I think the hardest thing with presidential politics is it's this awful binary choice. It's this or that. So, and I think that's what trying to convince people about the danger of third parties. And that's this election, that's really nerve wracking because of Stein and, Cornel West is running, but Kennedy too. Although it looks like Kennedy might be taking more votes from Biden, from Trump. So we'll see what happens. But these third party votes as a way to sort of people to vote and say, well, I don't like what's on offer and the danger of that. I think you're really right about, I really agree with you about thinking long term about who do people want to vote for in the primary in 2027, 2026 for the next person? How do we get candidate quality long term? Like, it does require that kind of thinking. And I think rather than just sort of inheriting somebody who wins and then feeling like stuck with this person. But I think it's about who you can pressure more effectively. And so deciding ideologically for yourself, who is more subject to pressure. So I feel like if you're a progressive, Biden is the one more subject to pressure. So I think the election is one day, and then there's the aftermath of the election, and who can you do the most? Who can you bend to your will more effectively because he needs your vote, versus the person who doesn't have any interest in your vote, is not really gonna be, is serving other masters. So that's the issue I think about. I'm not sure if that's satisfying. But
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. And I think that you and folks in, in your age range or generation, sorry, I'm like an old person. I don't know how many generations removed I am already. One thing I would caution is that it sets a precedent either way, right? So you have to choose which precedent, right, matters most to you, right? So voting for Biden, for example, sets a particular kind of precedent that, he can just have your vote and nothing may change. Not voting sets a precedent. Voting for Trump sets a precedent, right? So it all does something. And I think it's up to, individuals to figure out what something it is that you might want to do, but also not to think about it so individually. Right? If you think about your community, right, what you do with your vote is going to have an impact in your community, right? And it may not be, it may not be satisfactory, right? As you can tell, neither of us tackled the question of what we're looking forward to in 2024, what questions we have. We're much more excited about you all and young people and getting engaged. And that would be my answer to that, actually. Like, what am I going to look forward to? Young folks, right? Being engaged, participating despite, right, all that's going on, right? And in spite of, right? And I think that sets a precedent, right? That you think that because we're young and we use social media, that we're not going to do anything, that we're going to stay home, and that these campaigns are going to get us. But in fact, look at us making lines and showing up. And joke's on you.
Yamil, do you have any thoughts?
It's tough to follow these comments.
Okay, I actually do have a comment. I'm a moderator, but I have some thoughts on this. And I think it goes along the lines of what you were saying earlier, Cristina, about what you do with your vote and thinking in terms of agency. I have, I used to be a community organizer before I went to school to work on my PhD. And so your vote, I think, and this is important, particularly I think for the young people, is to think about voting as community organizers think about politics, right? A community organizer, you don't have the luxury to just say, you know what, I'm sitting out. You just don't. Like, a community organizer realizes these are the issues that we have in our community, and I'm going to go work on this. And you have a lot of defeats, a lot. But then you also have victories. And so, I'm an American politics scholar, race politics scholar, but I focus recently, at least, on education politics. So to the young people in the room, the question of school loans, of getting rid of school loans, right? 10 years ago, you're too young to realize this, but 10 years ago, no one was talking about that. No, we were paying school loans, and I don't mean to kind of trivialize it, because you'll be paying school loans too to some degree, right? But it took organizers to bring this to the agenda. Now, is Trump and the Republican Party really thinking about school loans? And this is one topic, school loans. They're not. The other part on education, 20 years ago, the Democratic Party was all about charter schools, the privatization of schools, no different than the Republicans. Obama was the same as the Republicans on this. They're no longer that way. There's obviously some Democrats who are, but it's really hard for you to win as a Democrat with that type of agenda. Guess why? It wasn't because they decided that this is what we wanted to do. No, it's because young people who were organizing on education forced that upon them, right? And so, yes, people might be unhappy with Biden. They might be, and there are good reasons for that. But people have pushed the Democratic Party at the national level, state level, and local level to fight for the kind of things that you are concerned with. So to sit out is just not in the spirit of what those people have done, right? So those are my thoughts on that. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Luis Ramirez, and I study politics and social and culture analysis at NYU. And my question's more guided towards Yamil, but I'm sure you guys will have thoughts as well. I think now more than ever, we see Latina communities identifying as queer. And I'm wondering how you see either scholars or local level, like tapping into these identities to bring voters into local politics. Because I do see how presidential candidates often make promises on if you vote for me, I will guarantee blank. But we often don't hear local politics promising gay rights or promising trans affirmation. We don't often see that. So I'm wondering how you think we can use these like identities to tap into local elections.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been working closely with a student at Columbia who has basically been collaborating with these organizations that try to get folks to run for office. And so the landscape really is, I think, still not fully embracing kind of an intersectional approach, in the sense that like you have organizations that are very much geared toward trying to get candidates of color to run for office, but not highlighting enough, I think, either the gendered or sexuality component. And I think the same also holds for some organizations that try to get female candidates to run for office. And granted, it seems like there have been some recent changes in some of these organizations to push for this kind of view. But I would say, like, maybe this comes back to Domingo's point, which is, if there isn't space for that, like, mobilizing and coming together and basically engaging collective action to push some of these organizations to take into account these considerations is one path forward, right? To say, like, what are the big organizations right now that are encouraging people to run for office? Let's push them on these points so that we actually have a candidate pool that represents the diversity within the community. And so I would say, like, that's right now, one of the biggest challenges to this representation at the local level is what's called candidate supply. So which candidates are running for office? And so I think working with these intermediate organizations that are recruiting, training people to run for office, that's a really promising path forward. And again, like, kind of holding some of these organizations accountable to say, like, you should also be fielding these candidates as opposed to singularly focusing on one identity, knowing that we are jointly constructed by multiple identities at once.
Hi, my name's Reed. I'm an undergrad at NYU studying multimedia, journalism, and politics. This is a little bit of a specific question, but it's something I've wondered, and I feel you all have the expertise. So I grew up in Florida around a lot of Cuban Americans, and I feel like I've really seen firsthand the sort of anti-socialist sentiment you guys spoke a little bit about. And I'm wondering if you see or if you anticipate in the future Cubans ever moving away from that as time goes on, because I guess, at least anecdotally, I feel it is not like they feel very scorned, and it's like, that's their own experience, of course, but like, just your guys' thoughts on if Cuban Americans are ever going to kind of maybe move a little bit more towards the Democratic Party at some point.
I think Yamil might have more to say about this, but with the data. But I think there's something really interesting about the Cuban American population in terms of age and demographics. So again, like college educated Cubans and people who are in Union City versus in Miami-Dade, in Florida. And so I think generationally, I think there's some really interesting differences. So I think sometimes they do get talked about like a monolithic community, and there's actually differences there that would be worth thinking about, and how they, how that works. I mean, the person, Maxwell Frost, right, or the guy who just recently won, was like young, active, like, Democrat, like that's Florida, right? That's another face of Florida. So I think there are possibilities, but I do think one thing you're also raising is like the idea that democratic social safety nets in the welfare state is communism and socialism. Like, I feel like sometimes this weird conflation about like what constitutes this fear of communism is so overblown, and needs to be like worked through, of like, what exactly are we talking about? Because I think that sometimes this language of the anti-communist discourse versus the actual policies being promoted are so different. But I do think Cuban Americans have a real political ecosystem in Florida. And so the kind of ability to kind of keep shaping each other over time is powerful. So.
Yeah, I think I would add, I was actually just in Tampa not so long ago, and I had my Lyft driver was Cuban, and he hadn't been in the country for too long. Um, all to say that he sort of reminded me, maybe, that there is this new migration of Cubans, right, that are maybe behaving a little bit different, have a very different socialization back in Cuba, right? Is very different, Cuba back in like, 40s and 50s, than the Cuba is, whatever, the context of Cuba now. And so part of something that actually he said, and some of the things that I've heard just anecdotally, I haven't done much research on this, right? But the ways in which newer Cubans are being pushed out of the boundaries, right, of little Miami, right? And Black Cubans are being pushed out, right? And so there's this, yes, there's this sort of like anti-socialism and conflation between socialism and the Democratic Party that seems very much siloed, right? And so individuals who are Cuban or Cuban American, who maybe have a different sort of ideology or a different take, right, aren't even being led into that conversation, right? So maybe we need to be in the outskirts of that and having conversations and learning about those individuals to learn more about, like, right, how are they processing, right, their thoughts around socialism, right?
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to this point of, Cristina and Yalidy have both highlighted, I think, really important generational components. So basically the first wave pretty much dominated, I think, by like mostly Republican leaning folks, but I would say Mariel and afterwards much more open to the Democrats. One kind of fun fact is that Hialeah, which was kind of the epicenter of the Cuban American community in Miami, actually their estimated vote share for Clinton was 50%. And that has actually dropped to about a third since then. So it's to say that, this perception that we have of like this being a very stable, Republican constituency, there's been a lot of fluctuation over time, and there have been ways in which the community has like further kind of entrenched into and become even more Republican. But there has been a lot of fluctuation over time. A lot of this is a generational process. I think it's also important. I'm glad Cristina brought up the point of Union City. If you look at Union City, Cuban Americans were kind of brought into like the machine politics, and a lot of them actually identify as Democrats. And so much of this is also a function of geography. And I love the term ecosystems, because in some ways, what's also happened to Miami is that you've had Venezuelan and Colombian Americans who have also in some ways been pulled into some of what you've seen in terms of this rightward shift. So Nationscape, which was one of the largest surveys that has ever been conducted in political science, had a very large Venezuelan American sample, and we could actually, for the first time, actually estimate support for different candidates across these fairly small national origin groups. And we found that there was like at least some preliminary analyses suggested that Republican support among Venezuelan Americans, for instance, was fairly high, comparable to Cuban Americans. And so, it's important to like think about how much of this is the Miami ecosystem versus some other factor. And so, it's again, the story is always complicated, and even with the conversation about Latinos not being a monolith, like even national origin groups, right? We obviously have to respect that fact as well. That even within these communities that we think we have a good handle on, you could have like, Hialeah voting 50% for Clinton, not even 10 years ago.
Hi, my name is Gabriel. I'm an urban planning student here at Wagner. First of all, thank you all for being here. When we're talking about the Latina communities and the Latino vote for presidential election, I feel like a lot of times we miss the fact that there's a huge part of our communities who cannot vote in federal elections. We're talking about immigrants who are not citizens. We're talking about Puerto Ricans in the island who have what we call the second-class citizenship. How do we fit into this conversation? It's been like this huge share of the whole population.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a really, really great question. And certainly a group of a community that we didn't touch upon in this conversation. And I think, it's a question that I, very personal as well. My mom actually just became a naturalized citizen. She's been here for like 30 something years. And she's so excited. She is so excited. She just cannot wait. But I think that the ways that you fit is maybe two ways. One is this engaging with individuals who can vote, right? And making sure that they understand like what's at stake, right? For you, right? What's at stake for Puerto Ricans on the island? What's at stake for undocumented folks in the United States with one candidate or the other, right? And so that's one way. And, I think that also engaging, participating in non-electoral ways, right? So, I think that, of course, without citizenship and without a vote, that is one way that you may not be able to participate, but you can participate by volunteering, by registering people to vote, right? Because it also matters, right? You are a individuals who is a resident of this country, and you are protected by the Constitution of the United States, right, which protects all peoples, not just citizens, right? And so there's a lot at stake for this community, and there's a lot to be done non-electorally as well.
I was gonna say really quick, I think that's such a great question. And I think that often when one of our colleagues who's Cuban American, who is not a Republican, but who Lisa Garcia Bedoya, what her first book was looking at all the ways that Latinos who are not able to vote, all the ways that non-electoral participation is political participation, and that communities that were being read as like not participating actually were participating in community groups and all in their unions, in all these ways that were not being read because they weren't voting, often because they either couldn't or they were politically participating in other ways. So I think it's really important we think beyond elections, even though this is a panel about elections. We think about beyond elections. But the other thing is, I really appreciate this point Yamil made about like running for office. Like, I hope people think to themselves, like, I think we should think more about like, maybe you run for office, maybe you serve for 10 years. That's something you do for 5 or 10 years, and then you do something else. Like that we should think of elected office as part of a set of possibilities in people's lives, rather than this thing that these other people do, not us. Because I think like, why not you? Why not you? And I think also because the way you run for office can be transformative, or it can be done in a way that creates the status quo. And one of the ways the first election I ever was involved with was in Watsonville, California. It was the first Latino running for mayor, and he was part of the Watsonville cannery strike. And one of the things he said at his first meeting that I remember being at, where he told all these non-citizens who were part of the community, he said, voting is the last thing you do. But I want you to come to town hall meetings. You can participate in all the GOTV work. You can go door to door and can encourage people to vote. Like, you can be a part of this election until election day. That's the only day you're not allowed, but you are a member of my community. You are my constituency. And I just thought, I didn't realize how radical that was at the time, but it was because he understood his election as a community uplift. It was something for the community, that he wanted to think about how people understood themselves politically in the community. And so I think if different kinds of people run for office, we could make elections become something much more participatory. Even though it's still a denial of their right to vote, there's still so many other things they can do. There's the other thing that we're not going to be able to have time to talk about, but there's also a history of non-citizen voting in local elections that really matters, and that's been something fought for in New York. And so, so citizenship is not always the prerequisite to voting. We make voting decisions locally. And so that's something else. If you run for office or you're part of these community organizations, you can change the rules. And that's important too.
I think in New York, you can vote for a school board.
Yes.
The local boards, yep.
And that was a struggle.
The last one. One last question?
Hi. Perfect.
We'll get one more, okay?
I'm Edward Frank. I'm a NYU student studying journalism and social culture analysis. I also work in the news industry. So something on the topic of where we started or around the beginning of the panel relating to Spanish language networks and elections. Back in last fall, Televisa Univision had an interview with Enrique Acevedo and former President Donald Trump. That interview got a lot of controversy just because they didn't question, some say they didn't question former President Trump as harsh as they should. So it makes me think, I'm curious to know your opinion on how you think it will change. Like, what will be the breaking point for English, in this case, English-speaking national news agencies and local news to constantly include reporting from the diverse Latino voter issues and situations and communities that seem to only be focused on full-time Spanish-speaking networks. Spanish-speaking networks being they're covering Latino issues. When do you think is going to be the breaking point that we get more of that coverage, constant coverage, in the English news agencies, in which we have a growing Latino population watching in the country?
Yamil, this question's for you.
Okay. Yeah, so I think honestly, probably not anytime soon. And I'll say because these organizations are so like laser focused on audience characteristics, like they are constantly analyzing like these like detailed Nielsen reports. And because our community is so young and because traditional news still skews older, my sense is like until we have like the median age of Latinos like pushing closer to like the 35, 45 range, where it's like I mean, granted, like by the time our community like we start seeing that more like demographic shift of getting older, we might not rely on mainstream media anymore. But I would say that it's unlikely to happen now just because the community is still demographically in terms of age still fairly young, probably not a huge chunk of the mainstream TV audience, but I think that maybe that'll change within like 10 to 20 years. But I think part of it is just pure demographics and like audience characteristics, or at least a large part of it is.
Last question.
Hi. I'm Talia. I'm a film and TV major, so I'm actually not like political like you guys. But as I feel that my whole entire childhood has been very political. But as someone who is like now a recent adult, I will say that around 18, a lot of citizens that don't turn 18 during an election year, there's kind of an education gap in terms of not only just like what to do when there's not a presidential election, but also how to participate as like an active citizen in this democracy. I know you mentioned canvassing and like other ways that you can be somewhat of a public servant. So I guess my question is, especially to the Latinx community, like how can we be encouraging each other to really be involved in our community, especially if you're not like coming from a state like New York where we kind of already know how our elections are going to go. You mentioned that the Dakotas has a growing Latin community. So in places like that, how can we actually be encouraging each other to learn about how we can be active citizens?
Question. Well, so one thing I will say, even with here in New York City, right? I tell my students all of the time, like one of my favorite politicians is AOC, right? And part of the reason why she's one of my favorite politicians is because she's young and she's unapologetic about her views, and she took on someone who no one thought she could beat, right? In addition to that, she's brilliant and all these kinds of things, right? And my view of politics align with hers, right? But so if we take her as an example, um, she she had to fight against an entrenched Democratic politician who was in leadership and had all the money in the world. She had to fight against that. So she's fighting for a vision of New Yorkers that she thought wasn't being represented by others, right? And so that's just an example of like even within New York City, even within like a district where they're Democrats, left leaning, that there are battles there that need to happen. And so if you talk to progressive advocates in the city of New York, they're like, there's so much we need to do, right? And so I don't want us to miss out on the fact that there are these real deal political battles for the kind of things that, I don't want to speak for you, but, for my class and my students, that they're really fighting for, whether it's housing, immigration, policing, that has to happen within places like New York City and within the Democratic Party for that vision to take hold. And so in addition to that, yes, there's all these other things that need to happen outside of places like New York City. And the whether it's the national politics, there's always an election. And I'm not saying that that's, it could be a bad thing, but there's always an election. There's an election for a school board. There's an election for city council, for the mayor, for county, right? State legislature, for the presidency, for Congress. There's always an election. So there's not going to be an off time. That might not be a great thing, right? Political scientists, we argue how that's not the greatest of things, but just as a reminder that there's always some election going on. And in addition to election, there's always a cause to fight for, right? And so that's what I was saying.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that you said right in the beginning, that you do like film, you're a film student, and that you're not as political. One thing I would say is that the personal is political, right? We are political beings, whether you call yourself that or not, right? When we walk out in the street, we are making political statements, we are making political choices, who we vote for, where we shop, whether we have Verizon or T-Mobile or and it's true, right? And some of these things like we actually don't think are political, right? But companies, certain companies, right, are very much interrelated with the detention centers, right? So, in those ways, right, there's always something to learn, always something to do, always a cause to fight for. But we move and breathe as political beings, right? And so less, when there's not a national presidential election, it is sort of hard to be like, okay, like where do I go? How do I make a difference? But as Domingo is saying, right, there's always an election. And, as young people, right, like getting really involved in your local politics, right? The way that judges are making decisions, right? If you have like immigrant detention centers in your state, right? Learning more about that, what's going on there? Can they be shut down? How are these individuals being treated? Also being part of like listservs with certain organizations, right? Like there's this organization in New Jersey, for example, that are called Friends First or First Friends, one of those. But they send, not only do they send like the regular newsletter, but they also send out, we need a driver today. Somebody's getting, being released. Can somebody come pick up this person? Or we need X, Y, and Z toiletries. My community does a lot on like refugee resettlement, right? And so, if we have stuff in your house, like you can go and take it to individuals who are trying to settle in this community, right? So there's always something to do, but I think firstly is really understanding yourself as always political and those around you.
That's all, folks. So please join me in giving a round of applause to our wonderful panelists. Yamil, I think it's like, is it like 2 a.m. over there for you right now?
It's 1:30, but
1:30, yeah.
Cafe,
It's time to go to bed,
cafecito
man.
before.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for participating in this conversation. It's been wonderful.